Hello, I'm Salmera. If you're new here, I make vlogs. I also make video essays on culture, mostly topics and issues in the Philippines. Of course, one of the biggest issues right now is Habagat season, Paxilica, and the Sara Duterte trial. Because I live abroad, my algorithm when it comes to updates and news regarding these three are filtered into something more digestible, and I swear these three connects. Anyways, the filler I have spews this narrative, and mostly because I saw this one video of the lady in Starbucks in Cebu, which I already wrote about, and another video that I just saw on TikTok yesterday about why we as Filipinos have inherent self-hatred. Those two kind of coexist with my topic today, so I wanted to bridge that together. And also, so basically the narrative with these two videos is that Filipinos need to be better, we need to take back our culture from our oppressors. The oppressors usually in this case seems to point towards Filipinos and is very broad, or the foreigners themselves. While working on this Substack that I wrote about the lady in Starbucks, I found this term called imperial Manila. My personal understanding of the country led me to understand that the inequalities that everyday Filipinos experience, like me and you, themselves have this long history that is almost misunderstood, and almost it's easy for our government and even for ourselves to point the finger and just say this is because of foreign invasion or colonial mentality, but it never really hits the mark, and neither does it address the actual problem. The earliest known term of Imperial Manila was in 1927 in an article in the American Chamber of Commerce journal. It basically describes how business and governance already revolved entirely around Manila under the American colonial administration. Just so I don't spread misinformation, I do have and I hate to be this person, I do have the definition of Imperial Manila. It is the pejorative epithet used by sectors of Filipino society, particularly outside Metro Manila, to express the idea that all the affairs of the Philippines, whether it's political, economical, and business or culture, are decided by what goes in the capital region of Metro Manila without considering the needs of the rest of the country. I'll get to a little bit more about how this system works, but I just wanted to give just a quick example of how we see this day to day. Obviously, we have, this economic and political centralization where we have national government agencies, these corporate headquarters, or major media outlets. Top universities are clustered around Manila. I remember how difficult it was to get not only a passport but also entrance to America, and having to go to Manila to process my papers. I don't know if that's still the case now. This was like 2010-ish, in that era. Another is this disaster response. Whenever I see anything like typhoons or earthquakes that happens in the Philippines, let's use Typhoon Haiyan and Yolanda, you could still see this in areas of the Philippines where you see the evidence of people coming together, donating, tons of media coverage during the time of the event. And if you revisit those areas now, you don't really see a ton of changes. If anything, it made matters worse. It kind of there's this dark history of relief response in the Philippines. I remember one story where they had to sell their bodies, sell their children in order to get food relief, which is supposed to be free and should be accessible to people who have obviously lost either a loved one or a home, or corrupt politicians usually pocket the funds or resell the relief that's been donated. That's just another example. Another example is this media and cultural dominance in the Philippines. Most of the time when you hear of the Philippines, you hear of Manila as a blanket term, almost as it's a shorthand for the Philippines. But, and I mentioned this in my past video, where I think that this reinforces this almost cherry picking of what is cool in my culture and what's not, because we just lack the basic understanding that the Philippines is different, island from island. And the video that I mentioned earlier, so basically she's saying that one of the main problems is colorism, that if you go to Filipino media, what you see are fair-skinned people, Eurocentric features, and I would say that's right and wrong. I think that when, large Manila-based media companies do cover people that don't look, pale skin or have Eurocentric features, like I mentioned, they're almost seen as a caricature. They're not really seen as being part of Filipino. They're almost seen as something that can now be celebrated because either it's trendy or it was accepted by a foreign gaze, if that makes any sense. Another imbalance that Imperial Manila enforces is this airport gateway problem. If you are outside the Philippines and you'd like to go, you have 3 choices for international airports. Mostly it is Manila, another is Cebu. If you live in the Visayas region, you could also go to Bohol because now they have an international airport. But most of the time you enter through Manila. Most foreign tourists get funneled through Manila, even if their real destination is Palawan or Boracay or Bohol or Siargao. And this forces layover transfers and Manila-based hotel or tour spending in a city that's congested and pricey relative to what it offers as a destination itself. I can't really stop thinking about, well, who benefits from this? Obviously, plainly it's Manila because of this gatekeeping role and this Manila-based tourism operations and elites capture an outsized share of tourist spending and logistic fees, not because Manila is the attraction itself, but because of where this gate happens. It reminds me of the Love the Philippines campaign. It was in 2023, and they had faced backlash because of the promotional video they launched were stock footage depicting scenes from countries like Indonesia, Brazil, and UAE. I mean, I know that this is a small story, but for me, I feel that this is how the entire country's regions get presented to the world, and that it sits in Manila. When the people producing the pitch of, these are the cultural sites, these are the tourist sites that you can visit in Manila aren't on the table, there's a ton of mistakes that can happen. It's almost like the country's tourism product is scattered across the provinces, but the country's tourism infrastructure and decision making stays concentrated in the capital. I want to use Siargao as a case study, mostly because they do have a ton of documented evidence. It is not possible for a foreigner to own land in the Philippines. You can use a Filipino, have their name on the land, you could do a long-term lease, or you could use the route of foreign-backed resorts. Or if you use Siargao, you see that some of the Airbnb listings aren't Filipinos themselves, which I think is very ironic, especially because it's not a big island. It's not big, neither is it small, but it is kind of alarming to see that most of the investors and business owners in that region are foreigners. And because of so, it is obvious to conclude that they would be the people that would have most say on how the country goes, what kind of rights they have, what kind of resources that are allowed to them. And it almost reinforces this idea that Filipinos have to be almost singular, that because the people in Siargao, for example, don't have the power to address this simply because they don't have the funds, they don't have enough political power to do so, because of course it's being driven by either corrupt politicians or foreign investors. They don't have a seat in the table. None of their concerns are addressed. And it's unfortunate, because it is true when they say, when you watch these foreigners or tourists that go to the Philippines, they're always raving about how, the Philippines was great, but it was the people. How can the people function if they themselves don't feel heard in their own country? I just wanted to talk about that a little bit. Okay, anyways. This is where I kind of want to go into the logistics of Imperial Manila. I won't make it boring, I promise, but I just wanted to cover this really quickly so you and I both understand where we're coming from. So about 80% of taxes collected nationwide, and about 80% of government spending gets funneled through Manila before any of it reaches the province. So this means that the province themselves don't collect or control most of their money. They usually wait for Manila to send a share back. And these major national taxes cover income taxes, VAT, taxes on fuel, alcohol, tobacco, etc., and custom taxes. Those are all connected by two national agencies, like the Bureau of International Revenue and the Bureau of Customs. Both are headquartered in and out of Manila. So the remaining slice is local taxes, things like real property tax, local business permits, and community taxes, which cities and provinces collect and keep themselves under the local government code, which I just found that out when I was looking into this too. I wanted to use 3 countries that have a different structure but made it work for them, mainly Switzerland, Germany, and Indonesia. They have the structure where local governments get an actual independent tax base that they control, and they also have a national equalization mechanism so poorer regions don't get left behind. And it's evenly divided into who is responsible for the roads, the health, and the schools. And authority and money move together rather than separately. I did also learn that during the Duterte administration, they tried to replicate this model, but of course it didn't include the mechanism that shares resources between rich and poor. So it would have ultimately just ended up creating more mini Manilas, and a lot of other regions would be left out. And one of the criticisms for his plan was, if you leave out, or if you just hand power to regions like Cebu and Davao without building a system where richer regions help and support poorer ones, you don't just fix inequality, you just move the system elsewhere. And this would look like Cebu and Davao, almost hoarding wealth and decision making the same way Manila does now. So one of the main criticisms I hear about anything that has to do with the Philippines is colonial mentality. While I do think that it does exist. I do also think that it's a blanket statement. It is true that we do see shame in other Filipinos about being Filipino themselves or seeing a foreigner more inferior than us because of this mechanism, or that other Filipinos look down on other Filipinos because they feel that they know less English. Another disheartening aspect of colonial mentality is that this idea of almost asking permission to like your country, like if unless a local food, a destination, or a talent is stamped by foreign approval, Filipinos would think that they don't have the scope to be proud of it and understand it. But I want to push back on this a little bit, because I do think it's just like a really lame, boring blanket statement. Believes that colonial mentality is a catch-all explanation, calling it misleading, incomplete, and often inaccurate. He gives examples of skin whitening, that this also predates colonialization. I also spoke about this in one of my YouTube videos. And today it's even more driven by Korean beauty standards rather than white Eurocentric standards, which is what Filipinos automatically think. He mostly points out that the term gets politically weaponized, with some leaders dismissing the human rights as Western values while showing far more difference to other foreign powers when convenient. It's just, I don't think that it is solely colonial mentality that is causing all of the havoc in the Philippines. I think that one, it doesn't address the fact that when you say this, you as a Filipino lose authority. And two, it's almost like in America when you say, oh, they don't like me because I'm gay, or oh, you don't like me because I'm a woman. It doesn't, and if anything, it kind of just lets the person who is causing all of this off the hook, because nobody's really, this is the thing about anything Filipino that I see on my algorithm. You almost hit the mark, but not really, because it ends the conversation, it doesn't broaden it. And when I hear colonial mentality, that's what I hear, because mostly when I see the term colonial mentality online, I then see somebody dressing up as indigenous Filipino when they're not part of that tribe, and that really just cringes me out. And it then reinforces this belief that we have to be super, super, super Filipino, and that a Filipino is one-dimensional. Which leads me to my final point, is who gets to represent the Philippines. I wanted to include this conversation I had with Professor Velasco in this video just to give a little bit of context. Anyways, bye.
Tell my students, the number one problem of Philippines is the Filipinos. We have such a beautiful country, rich in natural resources, and everything going right for us, but we choose to make things wrong.
Yeah. I read this, it was a blog post, I think by Maribeth, I think her first name was, and she coined this term, social amnesia, of how Filipinos repeatedly forget our own history. I don't know if it's conscious that's being done.
No, people know. People know the problem. People make jokes out of the situations. We have a wonderful sense of humor in that sense, but our sense of humor is not a virtue, because there are things that you should not laugh about anymore, because you will not be able to improve your lives if you just keep laughing about things. It's not a social amnesia. To me, the number one fault of the Filipinos is laziness. The laziness to something, the laziness to criticize things, the laziness to pursue critical thinking, the laziness to keep that mind open and learn more, the laziness, we know. We know the sources of the problem. We know what the problems are. We can identify. But the will to change,
Yeah.
the will to change, it's not enough that you know it.
There is no straight answer on who gets to represent the Philippines, but we do have candidates who are and have been leading this conversation and who is the representation of Filipino-ness. One, of course, we have Manila. The city speaks in behalf of roughly 7,600 islands that has about 180 ethno-linguistic groups. And most are not Tagalog, most don't share the same history as Manila, and most do not share the same dialect as Tagalog. And others, we have OFWs who, and I didn't know this, it was a term that they used for OFWs, Bagong Bayani, which that rubbed me off the wrong way, that, you know, modern day heroes almost, and this term is always used politically, and I feel like it doesn't address I feel like politicians use this term to exploit Filipinos even more, because foreign Filipinos, OFWs that travel abroad, are heavily exploited in those countries, and it doesn't answer why so many Filipinos have to leave the country in the first place. Anyways, them as candidates, because they are the economic backbone of the country, going back to the Marcos era labor export policy, the idea of Filipino Americans, when I see them making content about the Philippines, is that at Filipino parties we have this, we have this, we have this. But I find it so stereotypical. Every time I see that, I think it's called Hey Joe Show. I don't know if you guys remember this. This was like, I think this was in YouTube somewhere, 2012, 2011, I think, where it's these missionary guys who speak Bisaya. They even spoke to Duterte weirdly, and they would go around the Philippines, and most of it were stereotypical things that we would see in Filipinos, like leaving your slippers outside of the house before entering, stuff like that. Like, it just kind of reinforces like, it reinforces this idea that if you don't do any of these things, you're not Filipino, you're different. And I think that it just ends the conversation right there. I also see Filipino Americans describing their family dynamics as their family not having the connection that they would like. But my argument is that as a Filipino American, I don't understand how you could say that statement without understanding that there might be cultural and language barriers that you will not be able to have with your parents. And the counter argument with that is that they don't know how to speak Filipino. Well, my argument with that is that if you are grown enough to film a video of yourself online, you're grown enough to learn the language, and maybe by doing so, you strip off all of the stereotypes that you have about the Philippines. The third candidate of who speaks for the Philippines are and I hate this word. I absolutely hate this word. I don't know why, but it doesn't sit right with me. Diaspora voices. It's the Filipino Americans and other diaspora Filipinos often do the most visible theorizing about Filipino identity, like colonial mentality, for example. And this creates its own fiction, because people who left or people who were raised abroad, they are the only ones that have the privilege, and not entitlement, privilege, to be able to speak in behalf of these topics. But neither side has a contested claim to being more authentically Filipino, I guess. But I just think that even, for example, the Starbucks lady, it is clear that, you know, and I see this here in America as well, the people that are usually ringing the bell to a social issue in the Philippines are people who have the entitlement, have the privilege to do so. Most of the people can't. Most Filipinos are too busy trying to get home because there's traffic, because it's Baguio season, because they are not able to afford rent, because their prices might be raised because of Pax Silica. They have to keep up with what's actually going on with politics while also taking care of their family. There's just so much going on. And as a Filipino American, Filipino living outside of the country, demanding that Filipinos must strip everything because you think that we're not taught this history. We are. Somebody who was taught in school and grew up in the Philippines, by the time I was a teenager, we were taught Philippine history. We weren't taught, we were taught broadly of indigenous peoples. We weren't taught it in its full context because I am not part of that region. What I was taught is the negreso, who are from my region. And that's understandable. There's so much history to be taught in the Philippines, and I just don't think that saying that it's a Filipino's fault because they have colonial mentality, that this is why nothing gets addressed, is I don't know, it's kind of bullshit to hear. And lastly, our fourth and final candidate of who represents the Philippines now, and I'm not saying that any of these people should be, these are just what mostly I see who gets to speak in behalf of the Philippines, are de facto ambassadors, like pageant winners. We have athletes, celebrities, and content creators who become an international face of the country. And not because they have a formal process, because they understand the Philippines with its complexities, but simply because it's there, because they have enough views. And this loops back into colonial mentality, because the people that do end up representing the Philippines globally are often disproportionately the ones who already read as attractive or palatable for the Western and foreign gaze and their standards. And this just reinforces that issue rather than challenging the dynamic. And as a Filipino who is starved of their culture living abroad, you would see these representatives and stories about the Philippines and say, yeah, that is totally me. I'm going to start doing witchcraft now because that is what being Filipino is all about. I'm going to attack the Catholic Church because I don't have an understanding that we actually do practice folklore Catholicism. And there are other religions that exist in the Philippines, and mostly it's just Catholicism that has the majority, and I'm not even going to cover that. I'm going to start dressing in traditional Filipino clothing, even though I'm not part of their community, and I'm going to post a video about people at the beach laughing at me. If you go on YouTube, and I mentioned this in my other video, people were laughing at them because it was fucking hot at the beach. It is humid in the Philippines, it's hot as fuck, and you're wearing that shit at the beach. What the fuck? And then you point a camera at people telling them, like, anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you didn't, I'm sorry. If you have other comments or things or facts that you think I have missed, I'd love to broaden this conversation even further. My comments are always open, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.